Well, hello and welcome to number 2 of the Bach Talks. Today's topic is the chorale, especially as how it was realized by Johann Sebastian Bach. And then at the end, we're going to have a conspiracy theory. It seems to be a running current in American culture right now. Anyhow, our most persistent contact with Bach are probably some of the larger orchestral works. If you think about the programming on K-Bach, our wonderful station here in the Valley, you think about maybe the double violin concerto, Goldberg variations, Brandenburg concerti, almost daily. There's some kind of realization of that Bach repertoire. But I would put forward that our most personal contact and our most consistent contact with Bach are the chorales. There's hardly any American hymnal that does not have at least one Bach harmonization in it, especially O Sacred Head Now Wounded, is almost as a soundtrack to our Lenten observances. It's almost iconic when you hear that, it's Bach, it's Lent, it's Holy Week. At least for me, probably my very, very first contact were those smaller pieces in the Anna Magdalena Bach book. And here's a musette from that. Okay, good enough. So in one sense, it does have a good kernel of the way Bach composed. You take a central idea, and this time just going up 5 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. And do the same thing at a higher pitch level. And then you turn it upside down. Instead of going up 5 notes, you go down 5 notes. And then you finish out on a cadence, and that's that. So simple enough. Emotive? Probably not. So at least for me, that first real personal connection, especially that real emotional connection, was in the Bach chorale. One in particular, and that is a harmonization from the Christmas Oratorio, found in the service book and hymnal that Pillar of Orthodoxy published in 1958. So that for me was the real deal, especially some of these details. In the middle section, that rising chromatic bass line is just really fantastic. And then the cadence, and how the power of that rising bass line with the inner voices. Exploding back to the tonic B flat major. That's fantastic, just fantastic music. So the chorale has its own history, which would be actually a source for a whole graduate seminar, if not just a 20-minute Bach talk. The chorale originated in the very, very first years of the Reformation. By 1524, there are printed collections not only of melodies, but also very, very sophisticated polyphonic setting, especially those by Ludwig Sentfel and Johann Walter in particular. By the end of the 19th century, Johannes Zahn, a German musicologist, had cataloged 8,600 German chorale melodies. And of course, the English hymnody also expanding along those lines. So we're talking about a repertoire of tens of thousands of melodies, plus the fact that you can interchange texts with these melodies. And of course, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of pieces, not only in the chorale repertoire, but also in the English hymnody repertoire. So it's a sizable repertoire to talk with. But we're going to address specifically those techniques used by J.S. Bach. So the interesting thing about this repertoire is that it appeared very, very soon after the death of Bach. Now, collecting all of Bach's chorales in one big collection must have been quite a formidable undertaking, because Bach did not write a big treatise. This is how we're going to write my chorales. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The chorales were scattered throughout all the cantata repertoire and the Anna Magdalena notebook, for example. And the other thing compounding the problem, and I've never seen any discussion of this in the scholarly repertoire, is that the cantata scores were separated from the cantata parts amongst the family. So all this material was just kind of all over everywhere. Somewhere along the line, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach decided that posterity needed to see these chorales. And the interesting fact about this is, between the death of Bach and the Art of the Fugue, which is actually posthumous, and the first printings of the Well-Tempered Clavier around 1800, in this 50-year time span, the Bach chorales were the only things to be published, which shows how central they were to the understanding of his students and his families and contemporaries, the understanding that these pieces are truly, truly, truly essential to their repertoire. So that's, these chorales appeared in stages. In 1764, Breitkopf, which was a publisher in Leipzig and still an existing publisher today, announced that they had a manuscript with 150 chorales in it. But that was a one-time deal as a manuscript. Once you sold the manuscript, there are no more copies. But by 1765, we're talking about 15 years after the death of Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel published 100 chorales, and then eventually, starting with another student, Johann Kirnberger, between 1784 and 87, there were 371 chorales published in different sets. And this established the gold standard, so to speak. I'll show you that right now. And here is the modern realization of those 371 chorales. You can see that in the title right there. This is an edition published in 1941. And this is, like I said, the gold standard for any theory instruction in this country. For better or for worse, this is the standard. Forkel, who was Bach's first biographer, published in 1802, the first biography of Bach, as I mentioned. And he mentions, there's a whole section on Bach as teacher, and he mentions the centrality of the chorales in Bach's teaching. Bach did not write any treatises. His students did. His students wrote compositional and theory treatises. Bach wanted hands-on right away. So here's what Forkel had to say about Bach's teaching. Forkel writing, 50 years after the death of Bach, probably most of this information came from Carl Philipp Emanuel anyhow. So he had first set the bases himself. In other words, here you have the chorale melody, and then Bach would give his student a bass line, and then the pupils would invent only the alto and the tenor. By degrees, he let the students also make the basses. Every note was required to have a connection with the preceding. So this was his procedure, and very, very soon I'll take you through exactly what that might have looked like in the works of Bach. So if you're a student of Bach, like I say, if you had to look at Bach's chorales after his death, you were able to study with Bach. But as I said, his students did write treatises. Probably the two most important in regard to the writing of the chorale are that by Johann Kirnberger, Die Kunst des reinen Satzes, which was likewise published after the death of Bach. And one of the most long-lasting ones, and this is the one I had the most reference to, was by Johann Christian Kittel, a very, very late student of Bach. And he published Der angehende praktische Organist. Angehende means progressive. You started your first lessons, now you want to progress, angehend. The Progressing Practical Organist. This was published in 1801. And the thing about the Kittel was that this treatise was reprinted several times throughout the 19th century. And even towards the end of the century, is still being cited as kind of the way to do a Bach chorale. So let's see what these methods look like. So I took a very, very simple melody on my own. It's not really a melody, just 5 notes going up a D major scale. So here's our brand new chorale that I just did a few moments ago. Okay. And here is kind of a bread and butter harmonization. This will sound very familiar in its harmonic structure. So I first read out the bass line. Okay, that's one possibility. Another possibility of the bass might have been this. Which would have been nice too. It shows a nice kind of contrary motion is what we use that. The melody goes up consistently and the bass line goes down consistently. That's really part and parcel of Western harmonic construction. But I didn't do that. So just these are what we call root position chords. In other words, if you picked up a guitar and just read chord symbols, you'd have a D chord, an A chord, and so on. So here's what you get. Okay, and that sounds pretty much what we're used to. From our English hymnody, that's how it is. Now they're called root position chords because they're chords built from the bass on up. In other words, if you talk about a D root position chord, that means the D is the lowest sounding voice. So D, F sharp, A, and so on. That's all that means when we talk about root position. So the next step, and these were very, very graded. Some of you might know the name Gradus ad Parnassum, which was a whole description not of Bach style, but of Palestrina style. And actually, this treatise was well known, written by Fuchs, F-U-X, and published in southern part of the German lands, but still very, very popular in the north. And likewise, that method of learning how to write like Palestrina is as progressive, or as systematic rather, systematically progressive as that used for J.S. Bach. So we have all the notes moving together, okay? And if you want to get fussy about it, if you picked up Gradus ad Parnassum, that'd be called first species counterpoint. Don't worry about that, but just know that all this stuff is floating around in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even today, 20th century, obviously. All right, so the next thing to add a bit more spunk to that harmonization is to fill in the larger intervals. In this case, in the tenor, for example, we go from an F sharp to an A, which is a third apart, and you can put a note in between. Likewise, a C sharp down to an A, that's a third, and you can fill the note in between. So I'm taking my original structure and just filling in the spaces that I can. Okay. Still sounds kind of sweet, kind of tension-free, or friction-free, if you will. Now the next step is to add more dissonance. So instead of just those nice sweet sounds, you're going to add sevenths, or maybe something like that. Okay, so within the bass and the top of the inner voices, you're going to have more striking dissonances. Now the first way to do that is to add suspensions. This means a note that sounds harsh in one chord does not let itself go until the next chord. And you've heard this your whole life, literally. That kind of flavor, again, is part and parcel of Western harmony. So not too striking, actually, or not too shocking. But here we go. Okay. Now what's happening right away is that dissonance has a nice drive forward. All of a sudden you want that music to go somewhere. It's going to move somewhere. And that's what the Bach Chorale is all about. So another way to add dissonance is to add the seventh of the chord. All right, so if we have a root position chord like this, a third on top of a third on top of a third, we just add one more third. And that likewise you've heard your entire lifetime. Okay. So again, it's part of our common vocabulary, but again, that dissonance is going to help to move the piece forward. So here's seventh chords. Wants to go somewhere, and that's unsettled. And there's our suspension again, just to kick it off. Now we're going to take that forward motion one step further, and this is almost the ultimate step, and it really is part and parcel of that whole Bach sound. And that is, you ready for this? Take a deep breath. The secondary dominant. Now the dominant note in any key is simply note number 5. So we're in D major, And A is going to be our dominant. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. D, E, F sharp, G, and there's the dominant A. Okay. And likewise, the construction of that progression is just kind of in our psyche. So we take the D chord. Okay, that's where we started, and then we're going to the chord built on the dominant on the A. And when you put those together, you get. I mean. You just want that to happen when you hear that. Now, you can take any note of the scale and it can have its own dominant. Where I said the dominant of D was the A, if we go up to the chord built on E, the dominant of that is going to be 5 notes up, E, F sharp, G, A, B. So within this structure, E can have its own dominant. Likewise, the third note of our scale, F sharp, the dominant of that's going to be C sharp, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So what we're doing right now is we're speeding up the harmonic change, and almost every chord is going to be preceded by its own dominant. Here's what we're going to get. So here's our tonic. Now the next chord is going to be A, and the dominant of that is E. There's our E chord. Next chord is B, the dominant of that is F sharp, so we're going that. There's our F sharp. And we're kind of back to our own 5-1. Let me play that all together. Now we've got a lot of energy, probably more emotion, I would say, just like that early example I played, the Christmas Oratorio Chorale, Break Forth, the Beauty of Heavenly Light. Now, we can take that progression of secondary dominance and add that other dissonant language that we talked about already. So here's one more stage. And that's the real deal. When you think about Bach, that's really, really close to original sound. Now we can add one more detail for some more interest, and that is at the end, we're going to slow down the harmonic rhythm because it's got a lot of tension. And you add tension by doing rising notes in between. So let me show you. There's a lot more drive forward. So I can do the same thing at the end, except we're going to relax the energy. Instead of driving forward, we want to pull it back a little bit. So instead of thinking notes that are rising by half steps, we're thinking about notes that are falling by half steps to let that spread itself out a little bit, okay? So in other words, instead of that kind of sound we got, instead of, listen to this one. And that just wants to fall back down to this. So here's our drive forward. Then we're going to add some relaxed notes by dropping them a half step. That last part might sound familiar. Bach did that a lot, especially in the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Now for the conspiracy theory. In 2001, Helga Thune, who was not a musicologist but a violin teacher, was just infatuated with symbolism and coded messaging and numerology. I just found a little thing on Facebook today about the numerology of 02, 02, 2022. Wow, it goes back again. So anyhow, so you can do a lot with numbers, and you can kind of make numbers say pretty much what you want them to say. But anyhow, what Helga Thune thought she discovered was in the famous chaconne from the D minor partita for solo violin, she found a coded message relating to the death of Maria Barbara Bach. And that coded message involves a chorale Kriegslag and Todesbanden, which is an Easter chorale, and all sorts of numerological methods put the chorale all through this particular piece. There are a couple of other chorales cited, but anyhow, here's the beginning of that famous chaconne for solo violin. Now the first part works not too bad. The bass part actually almost gives you directly Kriegslag and Todesbanden. That's the chorale melody you want to pick out right here. Now as the piece progresses, what she has to do to make these statements work is chop up the chorale, stops and starts in all sorts of different passages, altering the chorale melodies, and it fits because of all the changes. But I've discovered in the meantime an even more infatuating secret about the works of J.S. Bach. Not only was Bach totally in charge of all the chorale repertoire, but he was also clairvoyant and prescient. In fact, prescient to the point of forecasting the career of the Beatles. So within the chorale, es ist gewisslich an der Zeit. Let me play it. Here's Bach's chorale. I've discovered in the past few months that you can code Hey Jude to that. Wow. So using the same techniques as Miss Trude did, here is that realization of Hey Jude with the chorale, es ist gewisslich an der Zeit. We'll listen to that right now.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take us that song and make it better. Remember to let her into your heart. Then you can start to make it better.
All right. Well, obviously, with a repertoire of 8,600 chorales, we can go on and on and on with these details and the wonderful emotive interpretations and different uses of "O Sacred Head Now Wounded," that melody within the St. Matthew Passion. There's just no end to that discussion. But hopefully, I have aroused you at least to a new appreciation and hopefully some insight into the importance of the chorale in the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. See you next time.